In 1841, on a Georgia plantation wrapped in magnolia shadows, a line was crossed that could never be uncrossed. It wasn't written down, it wasn't spoken above a whisper, but it set something in motion that made doors lock early and footsteps sound closer at night, because if what happened beneath that house had been exposed, someone wouldn't have lived to see the next sunrise, and the truth was buried deeper than the graves behind the fields. By 1841, the plantation existed in a world that pretended not to hear itself breathe. It rose from Georgia soil like a promise made too long ago. White columns bleached by sun, paint cracking in thin veins, as if the house itself were aging faster than anyone admitted. From a distance, it looked proud, ordered, civilized. Up close, it felt watchful. The air always carried something heavy. Sweet rot from magnolia blossoms, damp earth from the fields, smoke from kitchens that never slept. Even in daylight, shadows clung to corners they had no right to occupy. Nothing here was accidental. Not the placement of rooms, not the silence between words, not the way people learned, very young, where not to look. This land belonged to the Whitcomb estate, a name spoken softly in nearby towns, not out of admiration but caution. The Whitcombs were old Georgia stock, the kind that didn't need to raise their voice to be obeyed. At the center of it all lived Eleanor Whitcomb. She had arrived at widowhood before she learned how to be alone. At 28, Eleanor wore mourning like a second skin, dark dresses, high collars, sleeves that hid her wrists. Grief had narrowed her posture, taught her to move carefully, as if the house might break if she didn't. Her husband had been buried 3 years earlier, beneath a stone that still looked new. No one spoke of how sudden his death had been. Sudden deaths were impolite topics, especially when land, inheritance, and power were involved. Eleanor never removed her black gloves when walking the grounds. People mistook that for modesty. They didn't see how her hands trembled when exposed to air. Inside the house, time moved differently. Clocks ticked too loud. Floors creaked even when no one walked on them. Every sound echoed just long enough to feel intentional. The front rooms were kept immaculate. Polished furniture, lace curtains, portraits of men who had never smiled. Eyes in oil paint followed you as you crossed the room, their gazes trained by generations of authority. Behind those walls, rules were enforced without being spoken. Voices lowered themselves automatically. Doors were knocked on twice, never once. And no one ever entered Eleanor's study without being summoned, not because she demanded it, because the house remembered when others had. Eleanor spent her mornings reading letters she never answered. Her afternoons were given to bookkeeping, numbers written in neat columns, lives reduced to ink and weight. At night, she sat by windows. Reflected her face back at her, pale and watchful, as if another woman lived just beneath the glass. Sometimes she pressed her fingers to the pane, just to feel something cold and real. The servants noticed her habits before they noticed her sorrow. She wandered the halls after dusk. She stood too long in doorways. She listened. On this plantation, listening was dangerous. Beyond the house stretched the fields, endless rows of cotton that whispered when the wind passed through them. The sound was constant, like breath being drawn and released by something too large to see. At night, that whisper turned into something else. Low voices drifted from the quarters behind the main house. Murmured prayers, coughing, the soft thud of bodies shifting on wooden pallets. Sometimes laughter, quick, nervous, cut short as if someone remembered where they were. The quarters were built close enough to be heard, but far enough to be ignored. That distance was intentional. Among those quarters lived Isaiah. He was young, though hardship had pressed years into his face. Broad shoulders, calloused hands, eyes that learned early when to lower themselves. He had been chosen for housework not because he was gentle, but because he was observant. He noticed patterns, which doors creaked, which stairs betrayed footsteps, which rooms held tension long after someone had left. Isaiah moved quietly, not out of obedience, but survival. Inside the main house, he cleaned fireplaces that hadn't been lit in years. He polished silver that would only be used for guests Eleanor no longer invited. He carried trays through corridors that smelled faintly of old perfume and dust, and every day He passed Eleanor Whitcomb. They never spoke beyond necessity. "Yes, ma'am." "No, ma'am." But silence can stretch, and when it stretches too far, it begins to pull. Eleanor noticed him in pieces at first. The way his shadow crossed the wall before he entered a room, the way he paused listening before opening a door, the way his hands moved with careful precision, as if mistakes were not an option. She told herself this was nothing, just observation, just loneliness turning ordinary details into distractions. Still, she began arranging her days so that paths crossed naturally. A book returned to the shelf when Isaiah was nearby, a task assigned that required him inside rather than out in the sun, small decisions, innocent ones. That was how danger always began, dressed as convenience. Isaiah noticed her too, the way she watched the stairs before descending them, the way her voice softened when no one else was in the room, the way grief seemed to cling to her, not loudly but persistently. He knew better than to think about it. Thoughts led to mistakes, mistakes led to consequences, and consequences on a plantation did not come with explanations. The overseer had begun to linger near the house more often, a man with a voice that carried and eyes that urged. He didn't say much, but his presence was enough. Dogs followed him now, their nails clicking against the porch boards like a warning. Something in the air had shifted. Servants felt it first. They always did. Whispers shortened, laughter faded. People avoided certain corridors after dark. Doors were closed more firmly. Glances lingered just long enough to ask questions no one dared answer. Eleanor felt it too, though she could not name it. A pressure, a sense of being watched even when alone. She began extinguishing candles earlier in the evening, began sleeping with her door locked, a habit she hadn't needed before. Sometimes she dreamed of the house breathing, not the wind, not the trees, the house itself. Isaiah dreamed of doors that wouldn't open, of hallways that stretched longer the more he walked. He woke with his jaw clenched and his hands aching, as if he had been holding something back all night. Neither of them spoke of these things, because on that land, speaking turned shadows into evidence. The plantation continued its routines. Cotton was picked, meals were served, Sundays passed with hymns sung just loud enough to be heard from the road. From the outside, everything remained respectable. Inside, restraint thinned, and somewhere between the ticking clocks and the whispering fields, a line was being approached. Slowly, carefully, as if no one wished to be the first to admit it was there, because once crossed, it would never stop moving, and the house was already watching. By the time anyone understood what was forming beneath that roof, the choice would no longer feel like a choice at all. Tea did not arrive all at once. It seeped in, like dampness through brick, like a draught through a closed door. At first it was only timing. Eleanor began noticing how often Isaiah was present when the house felt quietest. Early mornings, when dew still clung to the steps and the world hadn't yet decided who it belonged to. Late afternoons, when the sun slanted low and turned the hallways amber, forgiving details that daylight made sharp. She told herself this was coincidence. The house ran on schedules. Schedules overlapped. Still she felt it, an awareness that tightened her shoulders before she understood why. Isaiah felt it too. He learned the rhythm of her footsteps without meaning to. How she paused before descending the stairs, as if listening for permission. How her skirts brushed the banister, soft fabric against old wood. He knew when she was near before he saw her. The air changed, not warmer, not colder, just charged. They avoided each other's eyes with care that bordered on ceremony, because in that avoidance was recognition, and recognition in that place was dangerous. The first crack came on a day heavy with heat, the kind that pressed sweat into skin and made tempers brittle. The house smelled of boiled starch and old roses. Windows were open, but the air refused to move. Isaiah W. as dusting the long hallway outside Eleanor's study, a task usually given to someone else. He hadn't asked for it. He'd simply been sent. Eleanor's door was ajar. Inside, paper rustled. A chair shifted. Isaiah paused, cloth in hand, listening. He should have moved on. Instead, he stood there long enough for the silence to notice him. "Isaiah," her voice was low, not sharp, Not commanding, just aware. He stepped into the doorway and stopped where the light ended, head bowed, eyes lowered. "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor was standing, one hand resting on the desk as if she needed the support. Papers were spread before her, numbers marching across the page in neat, unforgiving rows. For a moment neither spoke. The house seemed to lean closer. "I need—" She stopped, drew a breath. "I need a book from the upper shelf." She gestured toward the tall case behind him. It was a simple request, ordinary, but she did not move aside. Isaiah stepped forward, slowly, careful not to brush past her. The space narrowed. He reached for the book. Wood creaked under his weight. The shelf groaned softly, as if objecting. When he turned back, the book in his hands, he found her closer than before. Too close. He could smell lavender, faint, restrained, not fresh, lingering. His fingers tightened around the leather spine. Eleanor did not reach for the book. Her eyes lifted, just enough, and for a single breath they looked at each other. Not long, not openly, but long enough. Something passed between them that had no name, no permission. Isaiah lowered his gaze first. He always did. "Here, ma'am." She took the book. Their fingers did not touch, but the space between them felt altered, as if something invisible had shifted position and refused to move back. Isaiah stepped away. Eleanor watched him leave, and when the door closed, she pressed her palm flat against the desk, steadying herself against a sensation she did not recognize, but already feared, because nothing had happened, and yet everything had. From that day on, restraint required effort. Eleanor began assigning tasks and then watching from the doorway as they were completed. Not closely, never obviously, but enough to feel present. Isaiah began choosing routes through the house that passed near her rooms. Not entering, never entering, just passing. Every near miss tightened the air. The house responded. Floorboards creaked at the wrong moments. Doors closed more softly than they should have. Candles flickered without wind. Servants noticed the tension before they understood it. Eyes lingered. Conversations paused. Someone crossed themselves after passing Eleanor in the hall. The overseer began asking questions, small ones, casual ones. Why is the house staff changing? Why that boy inside so often? Isaiah felt the weight of those questions settle on his back like a hand. At night he lay awake listening to the quarters breathe, to the sound of someone crying "Quai." Tly 2 rooms away, to chains shifting as men turned in their sleep. He told himself this feeling would pass. It always did. But this time it deepened. Eleanor stopped attending church one Sunday, said she wasn't well. No one argued. That afternoon the plantation was unnaturally still. Even the fields seemed to hold their breath. A storm gathered without thunder. Thick clouds pressing low, turning the world dim and close. Isaiah was sent to the main house with linens. A task that could have waited. A task that hadn't. The hallways were darker than usual. Windows cast dull light that failed to reach the corners. He moved quietly, counting steps, measuring distance. When he reached the back corridor, he stopped. Eleanor stood there, half hidden by shadow, as if she had been waiting or listening. Neither spoke. Rain began suddenly, hard, loud, a drumming that swallowed sound and sealed the house off from the world beyond it. For the first time, Eleanor spoke without instruction or title. "You should wait," she said. He hesitated. "Until the rain passes," she added quickly. Too quickly, the words settled between them, heavier than they should have been. Isaiah nodded once. They stood several feet apart. Proper distance. Correct distance, but the storm erased the outside world. No birds, no voices, no footsteps, only rain and breath. Eleanor clasped her hands together, then released them. A small, nervous motion she likely didn't know she made. "I don't usually—" She stopped, tried again. "The house feels different today." Isaiah said nothing. What could he say? She looked at him, then away, as if ashamed of having looked at all. "I won't keep you," she said. But she did not move. Seconds stretched. The house creaked, a long settling sound, like an old body shifting in its sleep. Isaiah felt the pull then. Not desire. Not exactly. Risk. A tightening in the chest that said, "This is the moment." Moments like that did not announce themselves twice. He could step back. He should step back. Instead, he stayed, not closer, just still. The rain grew louder, closer. As if it were trying to drown something out, Eleanor's voice dropped. "No one will come," she said. It wasn't reassurance, it was acknowledgement. Isaiah finally lifted his eyes. Their gazes met fully this time. No lowering, no retreat. Fear lived there, in both of them, but so did something else, something sharper. The line was no longer approaching, it was underfoot. Eleanor took a single step forward and stopped herself, as if hitting an invisible wall. Her breath caught. Isaiah felt his hands curl slowly at his sides, fighting the instinct to move. The house seemed to listen. Somewhere, a door slammed, not nearby, but close enough to remind them of where they were. Eleanor turned away first. "You may go," she said. Her voice was steady. Too steady. Isaiah did not move right away. When he finally did, his steps felt too loud, too exposed. He passed her without looking, without touching, but as he did, the air between them sparked, brief, silent, unmistakable. By the time he reached the far end of the corridor, he knew something irreversible had occurred. Not an act, a choice. And choices once made did not stay contained. Eleanor remained where she was long after he left. Rain soaked the windows. Shadows shifted. The house exhaled. She pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes. Nothing had happened. And yet she knew with a certainty that frightened her. It was already too late to stop what was coming, because from that moment on, every meeting would be a risk, and every glance would carry consequences. While listening to this story, you can't help but wonder, from which corner of the world are you uncovering this secret right now? Write in the comments where and when you're watching. If you're drawn to stories history tried to bury, don't forget to follow or subscribe for more forbidden truths. Suspicion does not arrive loudly. It learns the house first. It settles into corners, into pauses, into the way eyes begin to count steps. At Whitcomb, the days kept their shape, but the feeling beneath them changed. Mornings grew brittle. Even the birds seemed careful with their songs. It began with a glance that lasted half a second too long. A maid in the back corridor stopped speaking when Isaiah passed, not abruptly, just enough to notice. Another servant pretended to adjust a tray that didn't need adjusting. Someone laughed and then swallowed it whole, as if remembering where laughter belonged. Isaiah felt it before anyone said a word. He felt it in the way doors were held open a beat longer than necessary, as if to watch him cross the threshold. In the way the overseer's boots paused outside the main house after dusk, their heavy tread measured, deliberate. In the way dogs lifted their heads when he moved. At night, the quarters pressed close. Bodies lay still longer than usual. Men breathed shallow. No one sang. Isaiah lay awake, counting sounds, counting risks. He told himself nothing had changed, but something had. Inside the main house, Eleanor felt it differently. Her name began to travel without her. She sensed it in the way letters arrived sealed tighter, in how neighbors' handwriting grew formal again, as if familiarity had been withdrawn. Invitations stopped coming. At church, pews shifted, not dramatically, just enough to create space where there hadn't been before. Women who once squeezed her hands now nodded from a distance. Men bowed and moved on quickly. She wore her black dress like armor and told herself it was grief returning, but grief did not watch her back. The first whisper reached her in the kitchen. She had entered without warning, another habit she had not always had. The room stilled. A pot boiled too long. A spoon clinked against the counter and then froze. No one looked at her. She said nothing. G turned and left. The silence followed her down the hallway like a second shadow. From then on, she noticed signs everywhere. A window she was sure she had closed left open a crack. A door she did not remember unlocking, standing ajar. Candles extinguished without her touch. The house felt less private, as if it were reporting on her. The overseer asked to speak with her one afternoon, not in her study, on the porch. That mattered. He stood with his hat in his hands, eyes roaming the yard rather than her face. His voice was polite. His words were ordinary. "Just keeping things in order, ma'am." Order, that word sat heavy between them. She answered carefully. too carefully. When he left, she did not go back inside right away. She stood on the porch listening to his boots fade, to the dogs panting softly at his heels. Only when the sound was gone did she realize her hands were shaking. Isaiah was reassigned to field work the next morning. No explanation. The sun was brutal, the work heavier, the distance deliberate. He understood the message. Distance is a warning. From the fields he could see the house, a white shape against green, watching from above. Windows gleamed like eyes that refused to blink. Every break, he felt the weight of being seen. Overseer nearby, whips visible, voices sharp. He worked harder than necessary. Still, eyes followed him. Eleanor noticed his absence immediately. The house felt louder without him, every creak exaggerated, every tick of the clock accusing. She asked no questions. She knew better. Instead, she waited. Waiting became its own kind of punishment. At night, she dreamed of footsteps stopping outside her door, of voices whispering her name, not in anger but in recognition. She woke with her heart racing and the certainty that someone, somewhere, was counting her breaths. The first direct warning did not come from a person. It came as an object, a folded note placed neatly on the front steps weighted by a stone. No handwriting she recognized, no signature, only a sentence, a reminder of what happened to those who forgot their place. She did not read it twice. She burned it in the fireplace and watched the words curl and vanish, knowing full well that ashes still leave traces. From that moment on, fear took on a rhythm. Whispers turned sharper. Rumors traveled with intent. Names were not spoken, but glances said enough. Isaiah was watched closely now. Too closely. Tasks were corrected mid-action. Instructions repeated. Mistakes imagined. One evening, as the sun sank low and the air cooled just enough to be cruel, he was called aside. Not accused, not questioned, warned. A hand on his shoulder, a voice low enough to pretend kindness. "Keep your eyes down." That was all. He nodded, lowered his gaze, but something in him tightened, because warnings were not given twice. Eleanor retreated inward. She stopped walking the grounds, stopped opening windows. Meals were taken alone more often than not. The house closed around her. She became careful with every movement, every word. She spoke less, watched more, and yet restraint has a cost. The more she tried to contain what was happening, the louder the silence grew. It pressed against her ribs, made breathing deliberate. One afternoon she noticed a chair in her study slightly out of place, just an inch, enough to know someone had been there. Her chest tightened. She did not call anyone, did not ask. She moved the chair back herself. That night she did not sleep. Isaiah felt the same pressure from the opposite side of the house. He began to sense patterns in his surveillance, times when eyes were busiest, moments when attention drifted. He did not act on them. Yet, because action would mean confirmation, and confirmation would mean consequences, the plantation no longer whispered. It listened. The distance between Eleanor and Isaiah grew measurable, carefully enforced, publicly maintained. But distance does not erase tension. It sharpens it. Every accidental crossing, on the stairs, near the well, at the edge of the yard, felt dangerous. Their eyes avoided each other, but their awareness did not. They communicated in absences, in pauses, in doors left unlatched, in tasks completed too quickly. Fear threaded through everything, and beneath that fear something else began to rot. Morality, not theirs, the world's. Because the whispers no longer asked if something had happened. They asked what should be done if it had. That question moved faster than truth ever could. Eleanor overheard it once. Two women speaking just outside the parlor, voices hushed but eager. She caught only fragments. "Can't be allowed. Example. For the good of." She stepped into view. The voices stopped. Smiles appeared, too quickly. Isaiah overheard his version in the quarters. A man spoke of disappearances, of names erased, of warnings written into scars, no details, just outcomes. That night, Isaiah did not return to his pallet until late. He stood outside the quarters listening to the fields breathe, to the house settle. He felt the narrowing of time. Eleanor stood at her window, watching lanterns move in the yard below. Watching patterns form and reform, she knew something was coming, not sudden, not loud, something deliberate. And whatever it was, it would not require proof, because in that world, love was never the crime. Being exposed was. And once exposure began, there was no safe place left to stand. What followed did not announce itself. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment anyone could point to and say, "That's when it happened." Instead, the plantation began to empty in small, careful ways. A chair in the corner of the parlor remained unused for days. A name went unspoken at supper. A pair of footsteps stopped echoing in a hallway that still remembered their rhythm. Eleanor noticed the abs. Before she noticed anything else. Absence had weight. It changed how rooms sounded, how shadows fell. The house felt larger and lonelier, as if something had been removed without permission, leaving the walls to adjust around the loss. She asked no questions. Questions required answers, and answers were dangerous. Outside, the fields were harvested on schedule. Cotton was packed. Ledgers balanced. The overseer's voice carried as usual, steady, confident, final. Order had been restored. That was how it was spoken of. Order. At night, Eleanor walked the halls again, not wandering now, listening. Her steps were quiet, deliberate, as if she feared waking something that preferred to stay asleep. She paused outside a closed door. The handle was cold. She did not touch it. Some doors, once closed, were not meant to open again. In the quarters, men spoke even less than before. Eyes stayed down. Movements stayed precise. Everyone understood the lesson, even if no one said it aloud, especially if no one said it aloud. Memory itself became dangerous. Isaiah's name was not erased in ink. It didn't need to be. Silence did the work far more cleanly. A new routine formed quickly, too quickly. Another man took over familiar tasks. His movements were similar but not the same. The house noticed the difference, even if people pretended not to. Dogs no longer barked at night. Lanterns moved less often across the yard. Whatever tension had once tightened the air now settled into something colder, heavier, final. Eleanor dressed in black every day, not for mourning but for concealment. She spoke when spoken to. She signed papers. She nodded when expected. From the outside she appeared untouched. Inside something had calcified. She stopped sleeping in her bed, took rest in a chair by the window instead, where she could watch the grounds without being seen. Sometimes, just before dawn, she imagined she heard footsteps where none existed. Sometimes she imagined she didn't. The house kept its secrets well. Years later, children would run through its halls unaware of what the walls had absorbed. Guests would admire the architecture, the order, the calm. No one would mention 1841. No one would ask why certain rooms were always kept locked, why one ledger page remained torn out, why a woman never remarried despite youth and status. History prefers clean lines. This story was not one of them, because beneath the polished floors and trimmed hedges, something remained, pressed deep, compacted by fear and obedience. Not a body, not a confession, a truth, one that had learned how to stay quiet. And so the plantation endured, as many did, as many still do, with its secrets intact, its silences perfected, leaving only a question that history never dared to answer. If you had lived in that era, would you have chosen the truth or merely survival?